This is the Misadventures of Team AJ. We are here in Wallace, Louisiana for a very important reason. That reason is we are at the Whitney Plantation, the United States' only museum dedicated to teaching or learning about the slave trade, the transatlantic and the continental slave trade here in the United States. First of all, we want to thank the Whitney Plantation for having us out, for inviting us out to do a private tour with them so we can bring this video to you and give you the best information we can possibly give through the lens of the Whitney Plantation members themselves.
So this is very important to us. We actually always wanted to bring a plantation video to you, but it had to be under certain circumstances. And we fell in love with the Whitney Plantation because they're all about teaching and education.
And the reason this is so important to us is because this museum represents truly the experience of being part of the transatlantic slave trade and the continental slave trade. We're not going to keep you long with the intro because we want to get to this, but we want you to know with Team AJ, Jen and I, we are truly wanting to educate and teach you about the experience. This isn't about blame, this is about preserving history in all its forms. I'll be the first person to tell you that some of the antebellum architecture is gorgeous, but there is a cost to that beautiful. And that beautiful we must explore. While the building is beautiful, the cost in human lives and suffering that building also participated in. So with that said, we have a tour guide waiting for us, and we guarantee that they're going to give you so much information that you're going to probably learn something. And with that learning something, it may give you just a new perspective.
So for us, it's very important that we can support a museum that's all about teaching and history. This is not supposed to be a happy place. This is not supposed to be a celebratory place. It's supposed to be about the history and learning so we never repeat the past. So we are here to bring it to you and learn today. And hopefully it will open up other people's eyes.
Today's experience will be one that touches every emotional heartstring you may have. And like I said before, you should feel something from this. So without further ado, no more talking. Let's go meet our tour guide and let's go get this show on the road. There's this traditional museum side inside the gift shop where it tells you about the domestic slave trade versus the transatlantic slave trade. And they tell you about sugar and the German Coast Uprising. And these are all the stories we're going to hear about on this tour. So stay tuned. I'm not going to go in here and if I go in here now, it's going to ruin a lot of the tour we're doing. So I'm going to leave that alone here. But when you come here, you start your tour here and get a little information about what you're going to learn out there on tour. We cannot wait. This is the Civil Code of Louisiana here. And this is telling you the laws based around slavery. We have books here about the struggle of slavery, the legacy, the painful legacy of slavery here. And before anybody goes any further, this is not about blaming current generations, but we should always remember the struggle to get to this point and what is needed to achieve even more to bring true equality to us as a whole. And all the merchandise here is either fair trade or made in the USA. And most items in this gift shop are produced by African, Afro-Creole, or African-American artisans and entrepreneurs. So this is truly authentic. As we meet our tour guide Ashton, these are some clips from later on in the video. And also remember, in normal circumstances, you cannot record at the Whitney Plantation. We were given special permission to do so. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully you enjoy this video.
This here is the Antioch Baptist Church. It's going to be our last stop. This was not original to the plantation. Very few plantations actually had chapels. This one was moved in the early 2000s by the former congregation, who had moved on to a much more larger and modern church by the 1950s. But this building was originally constructed 1870 under the name anti-yoke, that being an anti-slavery sentiment. This was only 5 years after the end of the Civil War, and so there's a lot of fallout in these communities. A lot of these these folks who were made Catholic, oftentimes by force or by their parents' right, and so on and so forth, do a pivot into baptism communities. And so the idea of being reborn and rebirth, of course, very attractive to formerly enslaved people. But we'll be talking a lot more about it as the last stop. This here is the Wall of Honor, a memorial to the estimated 350 enslaved people of the Whitney Plantation. This side of the wall in particular is known as the Indigo Generation. These people would have harvested indigo and rice in this plantation's early foundings. These are also largely victims of the transatlantic slave trade, that being the slave trade from Africa to the United States along what was known as the Middle Passage, a 14 weeks voyage that would leave as many as 20% of the African captured people dead upon their arrival at their New World destination. An estimated 2 million in totality out of the 12.5 million affected by the African slave trade. The information that we have regarding these enslaved people is largely from tax documents of the plantation, official inventories, and the like. Very little personal information. What we do have is first names, birth dates, points of origin, and occupation. Points of origin are crucially important for these sugarcane plantations, since oftentimes it determined what work the enslaved person would be doing on these fields. For instance, members of the Mandingo Nation, such as Musa here, were believed to be excellent field hands. They were thought to be from a warrior tribe back in Africa. The Mandingo Nation had no history of being a warrior tribe up until British subjugation. Along with it, the Fulbe, or Poulard Nation, as they're sometimes referred to on the wall, thought to be excellent animal handlers, as they had domesticated cattle back in Africa. But many nations in Africa had domesticated cattle. That's what they were known for here in the United States to make them easier to sell. You may also notice some folks marked with distinctions, things such as a Grief, Mulatto, Acadian, etc. A Grief being a Native American and African person, Mulatto being a European and African person, and an Acadian actually being an African enslaved person brought from a region in Canada known as Acadiana, where the modern Cajun culture comes from. But despite this being noted about some of these people, it should be taken with a pinch of salt. Oftentimes, the way this was determined on these plantations was by the pencil test, which an enslaved person was made to put a pencil in their hair and shake their head. If the pencil stayed in, they'd be considered a mulatto, and if it fell out, they'd be considered a griff. Again, not by any means a scientific process, largely determined by the humidity of the day. The transatlantic slave trade is officially abolished here in the United States in January 1808. And so as we get closer and closer to that 1808 mark, you're going to start to notice more and more people being born here in the United States, such as Moses from Virginia and John here from the East Coast. Just about everybody marked from the East Coast is being marked as the East Coast of America, not the East Coast of Africa. Now, in these plantations' histories, you do see a lot of names repeat. In particular, the most common names on these walls may not surprise you. It's Marie and Jean. Louisiana is a French colony up until 1803, and so a lot of the enslaved people of these plantations are forced to adopt French names, along with it French faith. These folks are all made forcibly Catholic. But along with adopting French names, this is all part of a process known as breaking, that being the breaking of the soul, the stripping of the individual. All of this is kind of first and foremost when it comes to chattel slavery. Sometimes this is occurring before ships even leave the shores of Africa. But in any case, it's worth calling particular attention to the African names that we do have on this wall. Musa here is actually the Arabic word for Moses, a name which repeats a little later in this plantation's history. We've also got Samba and Yero, Yero denoting the second-born male on a Tuesday, and Samba the fourth-born male on a Tuesday. This following kind of traditional African naming convention of the order in which you were born, the gender in which you were born, and the day of the week in which you were born. But with all that being discussed, and without this getting too far into the names that just kind of occur on these plaques down, back to the transatlantic slave trade. Now again abolished January 1808. The American domestic slave trade, however, is going to be well and underway 20 years before this official abolishment point, largely because, and especially after this point, there's an illegal black market that continues onward. This is well up until 1865 and emancipation. Just about any plantation that could afford to purchase enslaved people from these areas would if they needed to. And it's largely because a lot of these plantation owners had a lot of interest in black industry. It includes not only the propagation of sugarcane, indigo, and rice as plantations' key and cash crops, but also the refinement of these products, especially sugarcane. The process used on this plantation and plantations all throughout Louisiana was referred to as the Jamaica train. It's an African process in origin and is later supplanted by an invention by a free person of color from the city of New Orleans, a man by the name of Norbert Rielu, who invents the steam vaporization method that we even use into today. But for most of this plantation's history, the Jamaica train is the main process in making this sugar, and so we'll be talking a lot more about it as we get into sugar production. This side of the wall, known as the sugarcane generation, largely victims of the American domestic slave trade. That being the slave trade that occurs entirely on United States soil, largely centered on, again, the East Coast. These folks are being sent down south, either by forced march, brought along the East Coast around Florida and into Louisiana by boat, or simply shipped downriver, that being down the Mississippi River. It's also where the saying being sold downriver comes from, as a lot of enslaved people saw it as a death sentence to find themselves on sugarcane plantations this far down south. More on these constraints as the tour goes on. This side of the wall, again, American domestic slave trade, is much shorter than your transatlantic slave trade. You're looking at an average of about 4 weeks in comparison to the transatlantic slave trade's 14. However, you see a similar casualty rate, that being the same kind of 20%. And that's largely egged on by these forced marches. A lot of these people aren't even accommodated with proper clothing when they're made to make these journeys, so they're dying from things such as exhaustion and exposure in these harsher months. But the number one killer amongst these enslaved people, both in transit to these plantations and once they find themselves here, are going to most commonly be disease and infection, led on from medical negligence from the owners of these enslaved people. Again, more on these constraints as the tour goes on. At this side of the wall, you're also going to notice a lot more Maries and Jeans than Johns and Marys, as again, Louisiana is a French colony up until 1803. However, even after this point, Louisiana is still ruled by French law in regards to all matters enslaved people. Louisiana's civil codes regarding enslaved people, created after the kind of American acquisition, are going to be largely based on the Code Noir, a legislation invented by the French government to police colonies in regards of everything enslaved person, including both state-mandated minimum punishments. It's very important understanding a lot of these historic contexts, and so we'll be mentioning it a few times throughout the tour. But again, a lot more French names on this side of the wall, but wouldn't mind filing them down a touch. I'd like to call particular attention to Anna Wilson and her son Victor Heidel. Now, Anna and Victor are the only two narratives of Habitation Heidel, that being what the plantation was called before it was the Whitney Plantation. Getting stories from these sugarcane plantations is very difficult, and that's for a few reasons. Number one, if an enslaved person knew how to read or write here in Louisiana, if they were caught with paper or pencil, or even suspected to know how to read or write, they could be charged with le grand marronage, the highest caliber of punishment for enslaved people. In short, they were publicly executed. But secondly, the average life expectancy for a sugarcane field worker, the moment they stepped foot on a sugarcane field, was as little as 7 to 10 years. So there's very little time for an oral tradition to develop amongst these people. Along with it, field working beginning as young as 13 to 15 years old puts average life on this plantation as young as 25, meaning there's very little time for an oral tradition to develop amongst these people. We know Anna's history begins traveling from Virginia to Louisiana along with her mother and 2 siblings. We know Anna and her siblings were all under the age of 10 years old, as once they had arrived in New Orleans, they were to be sold together as a family. Louisiana had a law left over from French colonial times known as the Code Noir, which stated amongst other things that no enslaved child may be sold separately from their mother until they reach the age of 10. Once they reach that age, however, they are oftentimes separated from their families. Anna was kept separate from her family along the voyage, and so only was informed of her mother's death upon their arrival in New Orleans. Being that there was no mother to serve as the glue to the family, Anna is sold separately from her brothers. Bought by Marcelin Heidel and gifted to Marie Azalie, where she spends most of her life on this plantation as an enslaved domestic. Enslaved domestics working very closely with the Heidel family in matters of the home, things like cooking and cleaning, but are also crucially important whenever you're discussing information dispersal on these plantations, as these are the first enslaved people to know when the Heidel family is going to be by, when the strenuous workload may be more strenuous or the grinding season particularly lethal. However, this proximity to the owners of the plantation invites new terrors for the young women oftentimes serving in these roles. Anna was sexually assaulted at the age of 19 and again at the age of 25. From this, she birthed a child by the name of Victor Heidel. Now, from his birth, Anna was concerned with his emancipation from this plantation, and so once he got older, she put forth what money she had for her own freedom towards her sons. Victor was emancipated from this plantation at the age of 22, one of 2 grand emancipations in this plantation's entire history up until that point. Victor began farming sugarcane in an effort to afford the freedom of his mother. Anna, however, in the following years would die in service to the Heidel family. Victor continued farming sugarcane after his mother's death in an effort to afford the education of his children. He was then able to afford the education of his children's children and his children after that. Sybil Heidel, who would be Victor Heidel's great-great-granddaughter, was a civil rights leader here in New Orleans and no small player. Her husband, Ernest Morial, was the first black mayor of New Orleans in the 1970s, and their son, Mark Morial, was another black mayor for New Orleans in the 1980s and is the still sitting president of the Urban League, a group which rose up in the power vacuum created by Louisiana's banning of the NAACP to combat the White League, which is Louisiana's equivalent to the KKK. The KKK doesn't like Catholics, so they weren't too big here. But with that all being said, part of the reason why we know so much about Anna's history is because of her contemporary tie-in with the Morial family. Whenever you're talking the history of this plantation, spanning up until 1975, the 70s seem both very contemporary and historic as far as civil rights are concerned. One of many bells of the Whitney Plantation. This one still works, which I am going to demonstrate in just a few moments. But a few things about these bells. Used as a means of communication across the plantation at its historic peak, 1,800 acres. A relay of these bells were needed in order to indicate to field workers when they were supposed to be out in the fields and when it was time to go back into the cabins. These bells on this plantation, however, were used up until 1975, as it is an active wage-earning sugarcane producing plantation until then. These bells, again marking the beginning and endings of enslaved people's work periods, would sound off as well in states of emergency, such as medical emergency or if an enslaved person was trying to escape the grounds. But being active for so long, also to call attention to, this bell here was actually minted in 1870. So, a few of these bells that are actually minted before the Civil War, most of them as a matter of fact, have an approximate 50% silver content, making them incredibly valuable. A lot of plantation owners who were trying to escape persecution as Unionists moved north during the Civil War are going to start directly selling off these bells to judges and court officials for bribes, such as the case of Tulane's Victory Bell, if you'd like to look a little more into it. But this one being founded after the Civil War means it's strictly iron, but it still does the job quite well. If you'd like, I'll demonstrate it real quick. So one ring the start of the day, two rings the ends, and a series of rings in the case of danger. These bells again being used on this plantation until 1975. Here are the slave quarters of the Whitney Plantation. This is not the historic location of these structures, with the historic location being about half a mile downriver and a quarter of a mile from the river. Moved much closer for walking tours convenience. Cabins, the one right here and the one right next to it, the two with chimneys, are both original to the Whitney Plantation, constructed in the 1800s during the chattel slavery era of this plantation. The ones right across the way and towards the end of this gravel path, the two with storm damage, both are cabins original to this plantation, actually constructed in the 1900s during the wage-earning era of the Myrtle Grove Plantation. Despite these cabins being constructed almost 100 years apart and allegedly under different social circumstance, you'll notice very little difference in the layout of these quarters, and this is to mirror the very little effects that go into these plantations after Reconstruction. Part of the reason why these cabins are in such great shape is that they were occupied by the wage earners of this plantation up until the 1970s. Remnants of their occupation could still be seen in this old quarter, the one you guys are going to be taking a look inside. In the wall to the left, you'll notice a small rectangle cut out, and that was for a light switch box. Power wasn't routed out to Edgard up until the 1950s, and afterwards it was another thing for the owner of the plantation to charge the workers for. As far as living conditions in these quarters are concerned, obviously a little small. It'd typically be a family on one side and a family on the other. Though families on these plantations were very rarely a traditional nuclear family of a mother, a father, and two children. About 60% of this plantation's history was just single men, and obviously they aren't getting an entire half of the cabin to themselves. Rather, for them and most enslaved people on the grounds, it was a sleep where you may lie kind of sleeping arrangement. The remaining 40% of this plantation's history are the folks who try to stick together once night falls and there's a mad dash back to these quarters, the women and children of the plantation. Children, being anybody under the age of 15 years old, is going to make up approximately 30% of this plantation's population, and they're going to double as a secondary workforce on these grounds. More on the jobs of children as we get into sugar production. The remaining 10% of this plantation's history being women. Very little feminine labor on these grounds, however the women that are made to work these fields also face the unique challenges of being mothers of a plantation, particularly in regard to the heinous institution known as the fancy trade, enslaved people's prostitution. Women would be leased out to bars or sometimes sexually assaulted in their own homes, making nothing but profit for the owner of the plantation, as the condition of the child would take the condition of the mother, thus the child would be an enslaved person to these grounds upon birth. Along with it, there's the very real hurdle of calories when it comes to such a large family on plantation. The ration system of this plantation is 5 pounds of food per worker per week. This is 5 pounds of cornmeal, animal fat, molasses, and coffee. Coffee not being the coffee we know of it today, rather scorched cornmeal and chicory ground together. These rations were incredibly unnutritious for the only reliable source of food for, say, a mother who was made to have up to 8 children. However, that mother may very well be the only one of field working age in that family, meaning only 5 pounds of food for her and hers. Leads to mothers making the very difficult decision of deciding to send their child out into the fields, for the owner of the plantation maybe would have preferred it around the age of 13 to 15 years old. In exchange, that mother and her family receives that extra 5 pounds of food. However, that child's 7 to 10 year clock may begin that much sooner. Inside of these quarters as well, you can notice those large brick fireplaces, very infrequently in use. Louisiana gets plenty of two things, and that's heat and rain, and so for the most part, cooking is done outside of these quarters in order to minimize heat buildup in the home, but also the risk of fire. Along with it, you'll notice some wooden rope beds in the half of the cabins that you folks are about to take a look inside. These rope beds are easy to collapse, allowing for more floor space, and would be more common during the wage-earning era of this plantation and much less common during the chattel slavery era. Very little ownership over these quarters means you have very little interest in the furnishings therein, and so what mainly made up these cabins' furnishings was a pallet, a makeshift bed of pillows and blankets just running along the floor. But with that all being said, if you folks want to go ahead and take a look inside, you can feel free to do so.
Will do.
We've also got piles around these statues. This is an old voodoo tradition, kind of leaving offerings for the dead. You'll see a lot of these even throughout the city of New Orleans, but especially here on the grounds at our memorial spaces. A lot of folks like to leave things that enslaved people didn't have in life. You know, you see a lot of coins to represent the wealth they didn't have. You know, enslaved people aren't being paid for their work. You've got a lot of jewelry to represent that wealth as well. So folks have had leave pencils, as enslaved people didn't have education in their time. You know, it's very representative. Whatever you do, if you ever see any of these piles, please do not take from them. You'll find yourself haunted before you know it. This is ghost money. If you use a quarter of the stuff to buy a hot dog, that'll be the hot dog that kills you. I've gone this far without taking from any of these piles, and I've led a pretty good life, so I don't owe that. But go ahead and take a peek inside, folks.
Look, and really quick, somebody left a Pokemon card, which is pretty cool. It's right beside of Malaysian cash.
Come on.
Yes.
Interesting, you know, and I had a, what do you call that, an Asian transplant school from California come by earlier today. I wonder if that was them.
Yeah,
They oftentimes do just dump stuff, whatever they find convenient.
So
The kids
you
get
leave
really
this
excited.
year? You leave this year?
Of course.
It doesn't get touched.
Once it piles up, it usually starts falling off the porch, and that's usually our cue to clear it.
Okay.
But what we do with it, we've got this this big, like, Christmas decoration container full of all of this stuff.
Oh.
Whenever I first started here, it was 3-gallon-sized Ziploc bags. I don't know if we really have a plan with what to do with all this stuff. I think we're just going to keep accumulating it.
So let's go inside the cabin and we can see a little bit more of what he was referring to, the beds and the fireplace.
Those stories were finally recorded by the end.
You see there's the beds.
Sugar production here in Louisiana is still a $4 billion industry. You guys undoubtedly noticed sugarcane on your way into the Whitney today. We're quite frankly surrounded by it. Got some right beyond us of our back fence property, some off to this side of us, and in between us and the Mississippi River. The only reason why this side is another sugarcane field is that it's another sugarcane plantation. The only cane grown by the Whitney, though, is a small crop right across from the cabins. Mainly got it here so folks who've never seen cane before can feel free to interact with it. For those of you unfamiliar, though, cane develops serrations on the edges of the leaves. Very smooth going this way, very rough going this way. And as you're rubbing your fingers on this, you can feel a slight powder develop. That powder is an anticoagulant agent. Essentially, the cut from this is like a paper cut, except it can stay open for upwards of a week. Speaking historically, enslaved people get covered in these cuts in their day-to-day work in the fields. These cuts are small and insignificant, they're open for so long, very likely to get infected. That infection on these plantations oftentimes spells out amputation, as healthcare is reactionary at best. Amputation usually leads to gangrene, further amputation, further gangrene, and so on and so forth.
7 to 10 years ago.
7 to 10 years. Again, disease and infection, the #1 killer, and it's also some of the longest ways to die on a plantation. But not only do you have the cane itself seemingly out to get these people, but many dangers that lurk in fields here in Sportsman's Paradise. We have tons of venomous snakes, some of the most dangerous of which being the water moccasin, a territorial river snake which runs up to noises, doesn't run away from them, and drains its entire venom sacs in a single strike, doesn't do warning bites. Far from it is the most dangerous reptile in that field, though, as before this plantation was 1,800 acres of sugarcane field, it was 1,800 acres of undisturbed marshland, and so largely due to habitat destruction, Louisiana alligators were wandering the then habitation High Dell and even the modern Whitney Plantation. If I see any, I like to point them out. But in any case, you've got the alligators, a lot of the dangerous reptiles and other wildlife. We've got cougars on the woodlines and things like that. But, whenever we're talking insects and a lot more of the common pests, mosquitoes. This was a rice plantation, which means for most of the year, these fields are hundreds of acres of stagnant water. Ideal breeding grounds for these pests. Now, modernly, the stagnant water you see out here at the Whitney, especially in these pots, has been treated with some mosquito dunks. They're actually doing a lot to kind of help minimize the mosquito population out here. Anytime a mosquito tries to land in that water, it slips into it, killing it and the larvae. But not just sugarcane being grown on this plantation, we also do have a small patch of indigo, the earliest cash crop of these grounds. Beginning in 1752, this is an indigo and rice plantation. Rice being some of the only thing keeping New Orleans from strictly being a city that the French government loves to send convicts and prostitutes to die in. It was the only thing that could grow well in the flooded fields out here and in the areas around these plantations, propagated firstly by enslaved people, and to such success the owners of these plantations adopted it wide scale. Indigo, up until the early 1800s, was just about the only plant you could extract a blue dye from. And so blue dye in itself becomes a massive expression of wealth. But over the course of the 1800s, it goes from being something that you see on the wealthiest debutantes' ball dresses to blue jeans for convicts over the course of about a decade. And this is with production in India ramping up and also the creation of synthetic blue dye. A lot of these struggling indigo plantations pivot into sugarcane, as along with it, it lines up pretty much side to side and very parallel to the Haitian Revolution, which leaves a lot of displaced sugarcane plantation owners, bringing with them a lot of their enslaved people and their talents, which is how some of the first sugarcane plantations, large scale, get started here. Some of the first sugarcane plantations actually begin here in Louisiana around the 1760s.
I have one question.
Go on. Mm-hmm.
So if the slaves would get hurt in the fields and they would get injuries and they had to have an amputation and they could not work the fields anymore, what would happen at that point?
There is at no state at which a owner of the plantation will not try to make a field worker work the field. If they are missing an arm, they are kept on plantation as they're actually less valuable sold off. Maiming is one of the most common kind of injuries on these plantations, both from amputations in relation to infection, but also because of the grinding season. Cane must be fed through large grinding stone cylinders in order to get the sugar water out of the crop. This is either powered by steam power or mule, and in either case there's no emergency stop switch. People working 16 to 20-hour work shifts around the grinding season means these industrial accidents are bound to occur, and again greatly contributing to the number of one-armed people on a plantation. Also, these kettles, necessary for the brown sugar and molasses creation of this plantation. Sugar water's put in, brown sugar and molasses is taken out by the end. This whole process can last 4 to 6 hours, but again, through the grinding season, these pots are very rarely empty, especially whenever you're talking these two first steps. Here we have Le Grand. Le Grand is a preparatory phase ready to get the substance warm enough to chemically react with the next step of the mixture and the first step of the process. Here as well, oftentimes surface impurities are strained off. A lot of dirt, foreign debris, whatever it may be, can find their way into these pots, and so physical impurities are scraped off the top before being processed into our next step, le propre. Now, All of this work is largely being delegated by a sugar master, usually the oldest man on a plantation. Having living through multiple sugarcane grinding seasons, he's the enslaved person who is most intimately familiar with the details of this process, and so he's the one delegating work from a catwalk all around these pots. The substance is handled by sauce pot on the end of a very long stick. This substance gets third-degree burns hot very quickly, so you really don't want to get too close to these pots. Le propre is whenever a liming agent is added. This is also known as the clarification stage. Granules of brown sugar begin developing in this stage, though aren't completely present if there's too much moisture in the mix, and the substance really starts to kind of whiten. But this is because of crushed up limestone being added into this mix. This chemical reaction begins to take place, but there's not enough heat in the system to really get it fully undergone. And so, into our next step. Here, we have le flambe. Now, le flambe is the hottest process of this whole step. It is a very high heat process meant to boil out excess moisture. Sugar water is about 70% water and 30% sugar. That's why these pots get smaller and smaller as this process goes on, as more and more of this moisture gets boiled out. The fires of le propre and le flambe are much smaller, at least providing less heat to the overall system than these in le flambe. The whole point of this is to try to boil out as much moisture as possible before our last step. But at the end of le flambe, this substance is known as cane syrup. This is the first step in which this stuff is shelf stable. You can run this through a still and get white rum, which the French loved throughout the 1800s. You can also tack on this last step and make molasses and make brown rum, which the English loved throughout the 1800s. But in either case, neither of it is nearly as profitable as brown sugar, the chief concern of these grounds. And so, here to le batterie. Le batterie is the only pot with handles. It's the only pot meant to be lifted off of its fire. Here a striking point is reached, meaning the substance is entirely brown sugar and molasses. Every second after this point, though, the substance starts to burn, and so it's quickly lifted off of its fire and left to cool for a moment before being poured onto a drying rack. This drying rack separates molasses from the brown sugar. Molasses very much being a byproduct of this process and not by any means the chief concern of the plantation. It was oftentimes the only food source readily made available to enslaved people at will, leading to a wide variety of other nutritional illnesses affecting these people, not only the general malnutrition, but things such as high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes also running rampant in these communities. The brown sugar was the chief concern of these grounds, producing approximately 275,000 pounds as a year-round average, and 410,000 pounds at a historic peak. Stint in convict leasing, again in use 1870 to 1890, though convict leasing lasts well beyond then. The 14th Amendment states that no man may be held in involuntary servitude unless he's serving a stint for a crime. This loophole gives way to many, many, many years of convict leasing following here in Louisiana. This structure would be used in hauling convicts from their jail site to their work site, and then back from their work site to their jail site. 12 convicts total, that is to say 4 per cell. Mind you, this structure was actually found at a junkyard in West Feliciana Parish, the modern home of Angola Maximum Security Penitentiary, who still leases out convict labor for 25 cents an hour today. But before they were Angola Maximum Security Penitentiary, they were Angola Plantation, and even to today, the convicts of Angola are made to weed the pea fields of what was then Angola Plantation. This is not distant history, as far as the structure is concerned. If you'd like to take a look inside, feel free to do so. This here is a reconstruction of the original Whitney Plantation's blacksmith shop, dedicated to the former blacksmith of this plantation, a man by the name of Robin Hydell, though that doesn't narrow it down much, as there were 4 Robin Hydells who served as blacksmiths on this plantation. The one that this is dedicated to was particularly taken from Africa sometime after the transatlantic slave trade's abolishment, we estimate around 1820. Now, by this point, both Britain and the United States had made it absolutely illegal to purchase enslaved people from Africa under the penalty of death, but for especially anybody who can afford it, this black market is going to continue serving these plantations well up until emancipation. This was another building that burnt down in the 1900s, though worth noting, these plantations tend to have a lot of convenient fires, as a lot of these buildings are insured. It's also where they contain a lot of expensive tools and things of that like. So once these buildings do go up in smoke, say in a year where the sugarcane crop isn't as lucrative, then they can receive a fat payout in any case.
So they would rebuild all these after the fires?
Yeah. The store gets burnt down after the assassination of Martin Luther King. The following year, it's reconstructed. and in service till 1975. So this is the carriage house of the Hydell family. Not much to say about it. It's where they kept their carriages. It is a 5-car carriage house, so it is kind of the modern equivalent to a 10-car garage. Any visitors of the Hydell family would be pulling in their carts here and then parking their horses right across the way. This is a horse and mule barn, one of many original to the plantation. 1,800 acres means, according to this plantation's official inventory, 60 beasts of burden in order to tend to it all. That's why animal husbandry skills were so sought after on these plantations, because of the amount of draft animals necessary to run this place. But right over here, this little gazebo area was actually the former site of our grain silo, one of the oldest and largest buildings on the property. But being one of the oldest and largest buildings on the property, it had to be deconstructed. We have since erected this gazebo here, largely so we've got a place to run to in case it starts to rain, but also a nice place to sit and chat about our next official stop, the overseer's house, that being that white house right past that white fence. Past that white fence is the overseer's house. The overseer himself was usually a white man in very desperate need of work, largely because the only selling point to this job is the fact that you get a house with it. It doesn't pay well, and the overseer is responsible for mounting a basic defense in the case of a plantation uprising, but that's not the overseer's only responsibility. He's minding most of the day-to-day of the plantation as well. The owning Hydell family was very rarely here. They spent most of their time in the Garden District of New Orleans, where they owned another mansion. The overseer minding the day-to-day means he's in charge of things like the administration of rations and also the appointing of drivers. Drivers being enslaved peoples whose jobs are to patrol up and down these fields in order to, again, set the pace for the workday. And if drivers are unable to deliver those punishments, then the same punishments will befall them. Certain quotas are set by the overseer and must be met by these drivers and field workers. But drivers are also very important whenever you're discussing rebellion on these grounds. They are the only armed enslaved people, usually at least equipped with a knife, rope, and a whip. But in any case, they also have access to the tools enslaved people are using in their day-to-day works. And on cane plantations, that means access to cane knives. So if you're going to arm a few of these rebellions, you usually need the assistance of a few drivers. Drivers and the overseer, though, very responsible for the administration of punishment amongst the enslaved people of these grounds. This being broken down very bureaucratically here in Louisiana into 3 major calibers: le petit métonnage, le métonnage, and le grand métonnage. Métonnage here translating to swamp run, to escape the plantation and go into the marshes beyond. But you know, le petit métonnage is minor resistance attempts. Enslaved people not waking up at the first sounding of the bell, not working fast enough, or if self-mutilation was suspected to be intentional. Sometimes enslaved people are giving fingers, toes, hands, feet, whatever it took to get a break from work. As in the incident of these mutilations, these folks are usually given some time off to heal. However, if these attempts are suspected to be intentional, these people are explicitly not given time off to heal, and after having their wounds tended to are to be charged with le petit métonnage, a state-mandated minimum of 25 lashes from a whip. Keep in mind, these are state-mandated minimum punishments, and there's no such thing as a state maximum. These punishments get a lot worse than what's on paper. Above le petit métonnage, we have le métonnage, which is enslaved people trying to escape the plantation, and is usually undertaken by single men, people who generally don't have much tie to the plantation, as oftentimes loved ones around the runaway are targeted instead by these punishments. Le métonnage is afforded 3 attempts before death, the first attempt being punished with the branding of the enslaved person's shoulder, the cropping of the enslaved person's ear, and 50 lashes from a whip. Part of the reason why the Code Noir is outlining state-mandated minimum punishments is to indicate high runaway risk enslaved people, and therefore high purchasing risks for the French or any kind of plantation owner purchasing these enslaved people, but also more than anything to just kind of set a standard throughout the colonies. The second attempt being punished with the branding of the other shoulder, the cropping of the other ear, and the hamstringing of the enslaved person, being the process of cutting both hamstring tendons to make walking incredibly painful and running impossible. The third attempt would be punished with death. However, in legislation, this is left purposefully vague, meaning not necessarily the runaway, as again, loved ones are frequently targeted instead. Above le métonnage, we have le grand métonnage, the highest caliber of punishment for enslaved people, reserved for enslaved people who know how to read or write, or in the case of grand rebellion, the punishment for which is public execution. We actually had a case of grand rebellion occurring a little further down River Road, led by Charles DeLone, head driver of his plantation, who led a militia of about 200 to 500 enslaved people strong down that levee towards New Orleans to commandeer a ship and then sail to recently freed Haiti, would outlaw chattel slavery only a few years prior, and will host themselves to one of the largest and most successful enslaved people uprisings in global history. But Charles alone was very aware of this fact. Being an enslaved person from Haiti in the years leading up to that revolt, it's very likely that sparks of the Haitian Rebellion found themselves here in Louisiana, another French colony. But 200 to 500 enslaved people is quite the variance in statistic, and that's despite this being one of mainland United States' largest enslaved people insurrections, and certainly at least one of the largest in Louisiana history. But very little is concretely known about this rebellion, as following the sentencing of these enslaved people, Southern courts burnt the complete court log in order to prevent information from leaking onto other plantations and sparking similar large-scale revolts. What we do know is that Charles alone and his men were stopped about halfway in their tracks towards New Orleans near what's modernly known as Destrehan Plantation, again about halfway along this voyage. These folks were stopped by state marshals and federal officials. However, only 60 men were apprehended, where the other 140 to 440 enslaved people went, very likely becoming maroons in the areas around these plantations. The swamps of Louisiana are incredibly unforgiving, but some of the safest places to enslave people who are spending their lives otherwise on these plantations. They're relying on the dangers of this swamp to keep patrollers who are oftentimes patrolling the Mississippi River and any nearby plantations to capture these enslaved people as fugitive slaves to collect a bounty. And so, those 60 men who were apprehended were sent back to their respective plantations for public execution alongside suspected informants. These folks were shot in the back of the head and then beheaded. Their heads placed on pikes all across the Mississippi River, from a little bit further downriver where the rebellion began, all the way to New Orleans. Now we have another memorial dedicated to the Lone Rebellion, which we'll be taking a look at once the tour is complete. But if we wouldn't mind filing a little further down this way towards the kitchen. We'll
Mind you, this is the swamp. It's humid. We're like Shrek out here, so expect that. So they have misters. So if the camera gets a little misty, it's because of this. But you'll appreciate it when you're here.
Here, the kitchen of the plantation. Originally constructed 1790, rebuilt following a fire 1830. The structure is going to be separate from the big house, despite the fact that all the food made in the kitchen would be going directly to the Hydell family, their guests, or the overseer, his family, meaning his guests. Enslaved people are responsible for their own cookings. Instead, this kitchen sits separate from these facilities for two reasons. Firstly, the risk of fire. While this kitchen did burn down in 1830 and took a year to reconstruct, the big house took 10 years to construct, so it's a lot easier to rebuild this one room than the entire home, but also the inevitability of heat. That big house is very well insulated, and these large ovens make it so the building gets to be about 120 degrees once they're active, leading to most of the meals being prepared in the kitchen to actually be prepared in the front yard of the kitchen. Meals that are prepared inside are usually a little more set and forget, including one of the most common dishes prepared on this plantation, that being squab or roasted passenger pigeon, a French delicacy. Mind you, a contributing factor to the passenger pigeon's extinction was eating them as delicacy. It's only about a 2-ounce bird. You get about an ounce of meat off of it. You gotta eat a few of them to make a feast out of it. This plantation had 3 pigeonaries total, 1 in the attic of the kitchen, and then 2 more up front, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. Those ones up front are going to be a lot more large and luxurious, as the front yard is much more concerned with the expression of wealth, just something to keep in mind whenever you see the much more modest one here in the back. Not just French delicacy being prepared in here, though. Oftentimes African home-cooked meals as well. These cooks being from the entire continent bring across with them their own food lineages, traditions, cultures, crops, whatever it may be. And once they find themselves here, they develop a very homogenized African cuisine, including dishes that are commonly thought today to be Cajun, but are actually Creole or African in origin. Dishes such as gumbo and jambalaya come to mind. Gumbo actually meaning okra in a lot of different African dialects. It was the original thickening agent to the soup. The French influence comes much later, with the addition of the roux bumping it into that Creole category, and jambalaya has its roots all the way back to Moorish conquest of Spain back in 700.
Go into the main house?
Yes, so this is the big house of the Whitney Plantation. Began construction 1790, completed construction 1800, and that was just the upper floors. These lower floors are added later in the home's history. The place was originally elevated, as everything between the rivers and the fields has to flood. It's the only way you can get nutrients back into the soil in a time before crop rotation, and also the only way you could paddy fields when this was a rice plantation. Marie Osley, however, the final owner of this plantation, as it was a chattel slavery plantation, and also the only owner of the plantation to stay here full-time, decided she wanted these lower floors to serve more of a use. Walling them in, now we've got a storage annex, pantry, dining room, wine cellar, serving area, meeting room, and office space, all on lower floors that frequently flooded. And so it became the job of enslaved domestics to take those furnishings and haul them upstairs and into the attic just about every time it rained heavy here in southern Louisiana. Enslaved domestics are also oftentimes keeping up an empty big house, as before word could get from New Orleans to the plantation, the Hydell family may already be here. So the place has to be ready at the drop of a hat. Along with it, a small retainer of domestics are kept with the Hydell family, wherever they may be, sometimes separate from their children. Another job of domestic care is oftentimes taking care of these children, and the domestics that are here all year round are usually taking care of the overseer, his family, and the guests he may have by, who is here all year round. But with all that in mind, we can go ahead and follow inside and start breaking down the architecture of this place. Real quick though, I'd like to call attention to these back areas. This is some of the only exposed joinery you'll see on this house. Mainly I want to call attention to this African building style. That peg hole and joinery system is going to be part of the reason why this place has been standing after 200 years of Louisiana hurricanes. You can see very clearly how those pegs fit through those holes and hold those timbers up. With metal fixtures, screws and nails and the like, you get a lot of bending, and with that bending, a separation of the joinery. But with this kind of natural peg hole and style joinery systems, these pieces lock together quite well, and they breathe whenever the house is being hit by heavy winds, say in the case of hurricanes. So, very, very helpful in this case. So with this inside, we notice a little bit more of this African building style. These square bricks are going to be very indicative of that. Also inside of these walls, we've got Mississippi mud brick on both sides. These days you've got a layer of plaster and Portland cement for about 2 inches on either side. But if you look at these doorways, you'll notice they're very thick. That's because it's Mississippi mud brick stuffed with mucilage, mud and Spanish moss. Keeps this place cool just about all year round, provided you've got these doors open, generates a very nice breezeway from the river. That's why those doors in the front are taller than the ones in the back, because it needs to kind of funnel that breeze. But the big house was active and owned up until 1975, and so sometime around the 60s was accommodated with modern air conditioning, such as you can see those vents across the way. But as a bit of juxtaposition, those vents and these bricks. Stamped H for Hydell, as they were masoned on this property during the original construction of these lower floors by the enslaved who built it. In the same way that a painter signs a painting, a mason stamps a brick. Right around the corner and in the serving room, there's a jar buried about halfway in the ground, and that's a chiller. A small amount of ice and water would be added to this device to keep food and beverage chilled before the Hydell family's consumption. Worth noting though, getting ice down here in southern Louisiana in the 1800s, no easy task. Done by buying these giant 1-ton blocks of ice from the north that would be floated down the Mississippi River by a steamship express and were usually halfway melted by the time they got here. Then be stored in ice houses for the extremely wealthy to purchase, very much a luxury for the extremely wealthy. Average citizen of Edgard would have access to an ice box for another 100 years and refrigeration for another 150, since power doesn't get routed out to Edgard until 1950. Think of it as a really inefficient ice box, but in that inefficiency, again, a massive expression of wealth. The whole point of this house, above livability even, is that expression of wealth. It's why the house is a lot wider than it is tall or deep, as a means to look as big as possible to the folks going by on the roads and on the rivers. It being a thinner home also means that you can create that cross breeze effect. But in any case, there's a lot of expressions of wealth to continue in regards to this big house. We'll be talking a lot more about them as we get out into the front yard and also as we get upstairs. So actually cypress planks that's been plastered over and painted to look a lot like Italian marble. It's facade work, so wet plaster with watercolor, very labor intensive as far as painting's concerned. This was done by the same painter of the St. Louis Cathedral. Marie Osley loved his work so much, brought him out from Venice, Italy, and retirement in order to complete the works on a big house. Being this front facade here, a back facade as well, murals on the ceiling, family portraits above every fireplace, which are cleared out by the time of the Civil War, and also interior door and post works. Cost Marie Osley quite a pretty penny, but again, the whole point in this house is in that expression of wealth. Worth noting as well, marble's a rock. You can get it from Virginia. It doesn't have the same kind of expression of wealth as this massive commissioned piece does. So, with that as well, secondly, as we notice, this porch is a little slanted. This is to allow for watershed. A lot of rain out here. You really don't want this upper floor getting too wet. So, even though this stuff is cypress wood, it's very water damage resistant, you still want to make every effort in keeping this place here for 200 years. Even whenever this place is first constructed, 1790 to 1800, the primary concern of this place still looks even to today in keeping it standing.
Even the post here is done the same.
Exactly, and you should see the back facade is it seems like the Heidel family is displaying this to the public and then that to the guests. In that it's almost a completely different style. I'd even consider it like a higher class of painting on the other side.
Oh no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right, because this is the front of the house.
Yes, so
the river's right there.
Yes,
the river.
So right past us we have a buffer zone. Past that buffer zone, our levee. Past that levee, another buffer zone, and then that tree line, which you might not be able to see it from up here, marks our side of the river today. But back in the 1800s, River Road's called River Road because it's where the river was. It's eventually shifted down an old primordial channel. This kind of begins around Reconstruction and continues well until the 1940s. An effort to make shipping from Baton Rouge to New Orleans faster. But in doing so, that water is no longer hitting corners. And whenever a river hits a corner or a bend, it slows the water down. Being that this is now a straight shot from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, instead of the Mississippi River depositing alluvial soil onto Louisiana's coastal marshlands, it's instead pressure washing it. Along with it, any barrier islands that are caught between it and the Gulf of Mexico. So that's making hurricane seasons worse and worse. That's meaning Louisiana's losing an acre a day from our coastal marshlands. And if we did undo this, it would mean, thousands and thousands of acres of people's homes and businesses back underwater, including Edgar. We find ourselves in a lowland area. This place was meant to be flooded. These days, though, if Edgar's underwater, the whole world is. Between these buffer zones and that levee, you've got approximately 50 feet of elevation in between you and the river these days. Back in the 1800s, as little as 5. So, with that being said, and back to this big house, again, a massive expression of wealth, kind of one of the biggest ones in the home. We'd like to follow inside. We can kind of take a look at this ceiling mural. Again, very, very beautiful work. The man certainly knew his craft.
Yeah, this is gorgeous. Look at this, guys. Look at the centerpiece here. But it's not just the centerpiece. Look at the fireplace.
And that's all hand painted.
Yes.
Wow.
Now, the story goes, that is to say, the story Marie Osley was telling folks back in the 1800s, was that there was a poor beggar wandering the levees. And Marie Osley took him in out of the kindness of her heart, and let him stay at the big house for a while she was going on vacation. Whenever she had come back to the home, it was decked out in all of this painting. Now, given that time frame, I think it's safe to say this is not what happened. This is facade work. Facade work alone takes time to dry and more than a vacation trip of time. This is massive, labor-intensive, and time-consuming work. This may have taken years of his time, and mind you, man's already out of retirement. And then back here, something about this cherub in particular just reads too many zeros for me to comprehend.
Opulence.
Yes.
So look at all this. We're actually on the back porch now. Mm-hmm. Technically, you see the shades here. This is the Louisiana style
verandas.
Miranda, that's a great word.
Yeah.
But if you look here, this is literally representative of the area. And if you notice, you have the doors from this side, but they wanted to keep that air going so they can open up from this side, from the front side, and still have this enclosed on this side, and still have that air coming right through. So that's why you have these shades.
So very
And this is 3 stories?
Yeah, so 2 stories are livable. The upstairs is just an attic.
Okay.
Don't let folks go up there because they'll fall through the ceiling.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, though, back in the 1800s, the attic was much more serviceable. At some point, it's just mainly insulation and studs up there now. But back in the 1800s, like I said, it was the job of domestics to get up that staircase and up into the attic every time it rained.
And that's the stairs.
That's the
They
stairs.
take the tables, they take the chairs, they take...
Everything in the pantry, it's all dry goods food storage. So, it just becomes a massive, massive ordeal. Like Gone with the Wind and 75 other plantation movies that came out beforehand generated a lot of romanticization about these sites in the Jim Crow South, making it that much easier for these struggling plantations to pivot out of agriculture and towards tourism. A lot of folks who are seeing these movies are particularly seeing, Gone with the Wind, which was recorded on Oak Alley Plantation, has these big swinging boughs and whatnot. But Oak Alley was one of the few, if only, plantations to have a live oak galley historically. These largely get kind of cranked all throughout the plantation south as folks are coming out here for their bed and breakfasts, weddings, ghost tours, whatever it may be. And they're expecting to have these oaks in the backgrounds of their pictures, so they get spammed all throughout the plantation south. Relatively new in the identity, but very synonymous with the name regardless. This here is the Antioch Baptist Church, originally known as the Anti-Yoke Baptist Church. Now, carrying an anti-slavery sentiment, a yoke was a device that was often ascribed to enslaved people and beasts of burden whenever they're made to pull plows or push mills. And so it's a piece of timber that lays across the shoulders, keeps the hands up and the head down. These are also oftentimes used alongside slave collars and other devices in transporting enslaved people from plantation to plantation. Being an anti-yoke Baptist church whenever this place was first constructed in 1870 by 14 freed people of color in a town called Paulina, 15 minutes down the way, was quite the statement. Eventually, after a slew of hate attacks, they changed their name to Antioch. It's a Hebrew word meaning the cradle of Christ. But the Anti-Yoke and Antioch churches both functioned as a benevolent society. a way for these poorer Baptist communities to afford church services that whenever these people, or formerly enslaved people, are a little out of reach. Things like burial practices are going to be huge here in Louisiana. You can't do traditional 6-foot hole burials. Everything's got to be above ground, otherwise that body frequently resurfaces. It's oftentimes referred to in the 18 and 1900s as Christian burials. That's one of the things provided if you're in good standing with the Benevolent Society. You know, you pitch a little bit in, you get a lot back. Weddings are also offered free of charge here. You know, that's another thing that enslaved people are only granted with the express permission of the owner of the plantation, and is now available to these free people of color as they'd like. Along with it, baptismal records, which are useful for museums like us in tracing where these people go from their plantations and into their descendant communities. So, you know, this church has a lot of kind of convenience whenever you're talking about history. Also just in the bones of this place. I mean, not original to the plantation. Very few plantations actually had chapels. So in order to get it here from Paulina, it had to be ripped into 3 pieces. Mind you, the place had been largely abandoned since the 1950s, so it was in quite a state of disrepair. It was split right down the middle and in between these 2 windows. Into those 3 pieces was hauled 2 very kinds of self-glass. Mainly a nice place for us to sit and reflect about a lot of the things we learned today. Along with it, you'll find these statues. These are the children of the Whitney collection, created by a sculptor based out of Akron, Ohio, a man by the name of Woodrow Nash. These are artistic representations of people who were children at the time of emancipation, but had grown up into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s by the time their stories are finally recorded by the FWP, or Federal Writers Project. The project started during the Great Depression in order to get former anthropologists and historians back into work. Zora Neale Hurston finds some of her earliest starts in this field as well. But with all that being done, it's also worth regarding, the FWP was segregated, as that's the time spans in which this is occurring. So the Black FWP takes it upon themselves to record these last living narratives. And even though these people are, you know, nearly in their hundreds in a lot of cases, they're still very vividly recalling a lot of the horrors they experienced as children.
This is Mr. Ashton, and Mr. Ashton has been our guide today, our leader, the person who gave us the information that is so valuable to the experience. So tell everybody what you do here, sir.
So I really appreciate, you know, the kind of breakdown. My name's Ashton Verdon. I've been a tour guide here 5 going on 6 years. I started at the Whitney around 2019. Right around then I was getting my bachelor's in English creative writing, and by the end of it, you know, I was still working here, but I was in a new department. I'm with the education department these days. I handle a lot of the school groups who come out. Before I was working here, I was working in archives, originally archives at Nichols, and you know, I figured whenever I came out here, either A, I didn't have to work at a plantation, or B, I could get a higher paying job. But you know, a factor there as well is, you know, the Whitney is so new to the scene that I hadn't even heard of the place until I showed up for the interview. So you know, I've just been kind of hooked since, and I hope, you know, this video and the work you guys do gets more folks coming out here and learning about this history, because it's really a beautiful experience, and it's one I hope I can help a lot of people along. Part of the beauty of the Whitney Plantation is like the aspect of education, and you know, we do a lot in trying to engage with the next generation. You know, like I said, I do a lot of the student groups out here, and those are 6th through 12th, and by the end of it, you know, the kids are learning just as much as the chaperones are. It's really a beautiful experience to be able to do this every day.
Well, thank you very much, and we are okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for teaching us so much history, and we learned so much today. And thank you, a big thank you to the Whitney Plantation for giving us you to do a private tour.
So these are the memorial spaces of the Whitney. Kind of immediately counter corner to us, we have the Gwendolyn Midlow Hall Alley, which is a visual representation of an archival database of 107,000 enslaved people here in Louisiana. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall made it her life's work to get these people cataloged, database, named, points of origin pointed, birth dates, anything that she could gather is available on this site. And from my understanding, it's still an ongoing project even after her passing. This is not the full 107,000. This is loosely 1/8 of that total archive. So, you know, very much just to kind of get a scale for the whole thing.
So we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you to Ashton for being our private tour guide. We appreciate you. We've learned so much, and you're amazing and passionate what you do. So keep being amazing and awesome, and keep spreading the history of the Whitney Plantation, because truly we learned so much, right, hon?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
This was a wonderful, truly wonderful educational experience. I'm a historian, and I learned some things I didn't know today, so I'm sure everybody out there has as well. So one more thing we want to remind you, we're going to actually be back here in a few days for the Juneteenth Festival on June 14th. If you can, come join us here, because quite frankly, it's going to be pretty awesome.
Yeah, we had a really beautiful experience. It was powerful. It was emotional. It really, truly reminds you, I know, as we're doing the tour, to truly be kind to each other, love one another, you know, respect one another, listen to each other. This world to be such a better place. And that way we never have to go back and repeat the past. So a big thank you to the Whitney Plantation for inviting us out and setting up this amazing tour so we can spread the word and have people come here and take the tour and learn about the Whitney Plantation.
So with that said, les bon temps roulés.
Let the good times roll, and we can't wait to see you back here on the Whitney Plantation for the Juneteenth Festival on Saturday, June 14th. We hope to see you all there and come together as one.
Above our heads will be the video we did from when we went to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee at the Old Lorraine Motel. So check that video out, and you can get more of the history of the African American experience here in the United States of America.